Hello, everyone. Sorry for being a little bit late. I do not come to Tacoma very often, so I miscalculated how much traffic can come between Seattle and here, especially if there's 2 accidents. Hi, my name is Charlie. Also, I'm commonly known as Misu Online. I'm an avid collector of Japanese rhythm games and candy cabinets and just other Japanese arcade stuff. If you've had a chance to walk in the back side of the show today, you'd probably seen a bunch of rhythm games and candy cabs, and the majority of those are mine. I also run a small meetup in Seattle that happens about every 2 weeks called Game Center GG, where we just let the public come into my house and play a bunch of games. It's a great way to try things out if you're in the area. Well, so today we are going to be talking a bit about Japanese arcade games and preservation, specifically in the newer era of games. So I'm talking probably 2000s and later, and games that require internet connectivity to work. Afterwards, we'll have a Q&A section. You can ask really any question related to Japanese arcade. I can probably answer it or refer you to some place where you can get some more info. Yep. So, I don't know if audio is going to work here, but what happens to Japanese games in Japan when their service is discontinued and they don't really play good games anymore? And let's take a watch of this short YouTube video. And even if audio doesn't work, it will be pretty funny. So this here is a airsoft stage in Japan where they have sent a bunch of arcade games that are so cheap and so worthless in Japan that they're not even worth putting into a store for 50-cent play. It's literally dumped into a warehouse so these people can have obstacles to play airsoft around. And so why is that? Does not. Sorry, it seems to have gotten out of full screen mode. Cool. So, the modern Japanese arcade game is frequently actually leased now to an arcade provider rather than purchased. Some have an option to purchase a game, but most are actually lease only. And this has some interesting effects. So the lease is controlled by what's known as a security dongle. It's usually something that will plug in to the USB port of one of your arcade machines, and it identifies your machine and communicates back to the publisher's server. So whether it's Sega, Konami, whatnot. And when your lease is over, or you decide you don't want the game anymore, what then happens is that you mail your dongle back to the publisher, but the arcade machine is not actually sent back to the publisher. Sega does not want your old arcade game. It's a pain in the ass for them to manage. So what happens is they are going to use a distribution network to manage that. So you mail your dongle back to Sega, and you'll have somebody from one of Sega's third-party distribution centers come and pick your game up. So when a game does reach end of life, or really just unpopular anymore in Japan, the games tend to stock up at the distributors. And really these take up a bunch of space, and they don't really have domestic buyers for them. So it becomes a problem. When this happens, unfortunately, the majority of games are sent to a landfill. So this type of modern system really incentivizes distributors to find another way to make revenue off of the machines that will never get leased out again. One of the most common ways to do this is via exporting gray market exports. So sending these games out to countries where they were never licensed to technically be played. China is probably the biggest market for that, but there's a lot in Southeast Asia, Europe, and here. We have in the US a couple big distributors who bring in multiple containers, anywhere up to 10 to 20 containers a year filled with games. They're sold. GameStar is one of them. But still, when we get these games, a lot of times they don't have the functionality anymore that they used to have. They're gimped because without the security key, the games will either just flat out not function, or they would have had an offline patch delivered to them that usually drastically limits their gameplay functionality. So what do we do about it? Oh, hey, I forgot to talk a little bit more in depth. So what is the offline kit? Because you'll frequently see this for modern Japanese games. So this is essentially the last software update a game will get before the company discontinues full support for it. And in general, because they're not going to really make money off these kits, they're kind of rushed updates. What they usually do is slash out all the content that they would have to, if they would have to pay licensors in Japan money for. So for an example, in rhythm games, a lot of the music is removed in an offline kit because they do not want to have to pay license fees anymore for that. And they also just generally don't do a great job, so you'll frequently see things like you have to play the tutorial every single time, because in a normal experience, it would be the server that communicates with your card that you use to identify yourself on the arcade that says, hey, you've played before. You don't need to do the tutorial for the 20th time. But you lose a lot of that functionality when the game goes offline. You also see a lot of the secondary mechanics of games in Japan, like characters, levels, scores, anything that essentially needs data persistence removed out of offline kits. And then sometimes developers, really this is just Konami, want to charge you multiple thousands of dollars for this offline kit that's hot garbage too. So there's a lot of reasons for you to really dump your game and just not keep it in Japan. And then the other option is if the game is not given an offline kit, they're usually just killed off. Sometimes it's out of sheer laziness. The developer just doesn't want to do anything. Or sometimes actually a game is changed into a different game. The prime example of this in in Japan is Konami's Beat Stream, which was converted to a different game called Nostalgia. So if you ever have a chance to look at the two right next to each other, they'll be pretty much in the same cabinet, except for one is a touchscreen game and the other one is a piano game. So this poses obviously a problem. Once these games are dead and then the internet services for them are removed, the majority of these games are pretty gimped. They're kind of just a husk of what they used to be, and they're not really almost worth preserving in a way because they don't reflect what the original experience was like. So this is kind of where a new era of game preservation, at least in my opinion, has really started picking up. And it really focuses on both the preservation of the game, but also the restoration of the services around a game to make sure that you can have the experience like the game was when it was originally running. So I kind of want to now dive a little bit into more technical and kind of what are the components it takes to preserve a modern game. At a high level, there's really 4 core areas that you need to be able to essentially hack and build out to make a game work anymore. So one is the security and the key chip. So we kind of briefly discussed earlier that a key chip is what allows the game to be validated and confirms who the owner is and what the lease terms are. But most games will not even boot without that information present when they're starting their security. The second is game data restoration. So this is the process of getting game data over the lifespan of the game that may actually be deleted in the final machine when you get them. Afterwards, we have game server reverse engineering, and this is the process of trying to build out a replica server of the server that was there before. So replicating Konami's e-amusement server, replicating Sega's IME server. And then the final component is deploying private networks that can host this server code and allow machines to connect to them. So ignore the contents on this slide, because last time I did this presentation, I had Felix, who is actually one of the persons who does key chip hacking, and he was a much better explaining, but I'll try to give a high level. So as mentioned before, a key chip is a small security dongle. It just usually looks like a small USB device. And it is usually used in an initial handshake before to usually actually provide some information for the game to start decrypting itself. This is probably some of the most difficult black magic it takes to hack. Sega tends to use some open source libraries called AM Daemon that have been modified. So people who are like skilled in that will usually take a look at it and try to figure out how to replicate the calls that they're making. Konami has a library that they like. And so we get the advantage that these companies tend not to put a huge amount of focus into the security, because they're not worrying about everybody downloading their game. In the grand scheme of things, very few people actually have the arcade machines, and even if you do break their security, it's not the end of the world. You still, if you did this in Japan, you'd get sued, and if you did it outside of Japan, they weren't going to make money off of you anyways. So once you've broken the key chip, what that usually allows you to do is boot into Windows. And I guess I should have probably made a mention that the majority of modern games, American, Japanese or not, are all built on Windows or Windows embedded. So there's really no more custom PCBs or anything anymore, which in some ways makes our life a little bit easier, because it does make how security is done usually a lot more conformant than some of the older days like Capcom and their crazy suicide batteries. So once the key chip has been figured out and the overall security has been understood, the next step we can start doing is data restoration. And data restoration is the process of taking data that we have downloaded while the game was alive, whether through legal or questionable sources, and injecting them back into the game. Because as I'd mentioned before, usually by the time we can get these machines easily, and that private collectors can get them, they have been discontinued and they have been written with an offline patch that does not contain the majority of their game data. A lot of the times, the developers are quite lazy, and this is as easy as just going through a database or some files and changing a disabled flag from false to true. But sometimes it's not. Sometimes the data is actually removed. So when that happens, then we usually have to take more effort to figure out how to inject old data into a new game, into the current version of the offline game. And this is kind of one of the reasons why it's really important for the preservation process to start early, like when a game is actually alive, because you can just lose data that was pushed to a game and then overwritten by a different data update later on if you don't start doing this while the game is live. It does pose some legal questions, given that we shouldn't have access to data in the first place, but preservation has always posed some interesting legal questions. So once you get the game running, the next part is game server reverse engineering. And this is a very tedious process. It's unfortunately the process that most people don't like to do in preservation. And so the general process is to start the game and put something on the network to be able to see what the game is requesting and try to figure out what it wants back. So generally, you'll start the game, it'll crash because it makes a request to the server and you didn't respond with anything. And then you look at your logs, you look at the code that you've either reverse engineered through like DN Shark or various other tools, and you try to just build out mock statements to get the game to proceed. They don't necessarily need to be accurate the first time. Frequently they aren't. But you do need to get enough structure that the game can keep proceeding so you can keep on eventually figuring out all the endpoints to a game. After you've got all these endpoints stubbed out, then you take the time to start trying to figure out what the correct responses should be. And it generally is much easier when you have all the endpoints stubbed out, because you get a more holistic sense of how this server is interacting, where it's requesting data, the timing, and you can kind of correlate to that to what the game is doing. eventually you're going to end up with, hopefully, a functioning game. Now, sometimes we will ship out server code that doesn't necessarily implement all the functionality or the endpoints. But it can be an iterative process because the code does not necessarily live on the game that we're trying to reverse engineer, but the server that the game is communicating with. Once you have a stable enough server that you can run, then you need to be able to build the infrastructure and actually deploy these servers. That's just another whole level of extra skill and complexity to the process. Unfortunately, due to, again, this being kind of a legal gray area, most of the servers and the information about how to access them or how to contribute to them are in semi-private channels and not necessarily public. The community tends to do a very good job of finding people who have acquired a machine and giving them information, but it's not something you can just easily Google without having somebody next to you to kind of hook you up into a Discord server or something. Anyways, I had plans for a lot more slides. I ran out of time. So I'm going to talk over a couple more things without slides, and then we'll kind of move to a Q&A. I think the biggest point I wanted to make with this presentation was, if you're kind of technical or into programming, to give you kind of a high-level overview of what it takes to reverse engineer a modern game, but also to kind of encourage and showcase how game preservation has changed over the era. It's now something that usually requires dedicated teams and not individuals because the amount of skills required is very diverse. Somebody who is very good at reverse engineering or security encryption is usually not going to be the best web developer, not going to be the best infrastructure manager. So you need lots of people to preserve a lot of these modern games. Lots of people and lots of skills. There's also problems with this, though. Then you also have the question of what happens now when these private servers die? Because we've had a couple major ones go out. Who preserves the systems that are preserving a game? And this would normally be handled by open source software, but unfortunately it's not as easy because the laws haven't been clarified enough yet for many of these people who are writing these servers to be able to open source their code. And then the last thing is that it really is important to start preserving the games super early while they are while they're actually active, so you can collect the proper data and be able to properly represent the game when it dies. And one of the recent cases that I was working on is we started preserving a Japanese children's rhythm game developed by Konami called Osaka Doll. And the problem is the original developer on it, he had written the entire server code and everything, got the game working, and then I played it, and I'd realized that everything was wrong. The game literally did not play how it played in Japan, and the reason why is that person had never actually had the chance to play or experience the game. And so he was making guesses on how he thought the server should work and how the game should respond to that that were incorrect. And so it's really important to kind of be collecting the data and also taking notes in case if it's a smaller game or a more obscure game, or trying to find the very passionate fans of that game while it's still relevant in their minds to be able to properly preserve them. A lot of this is actually very similar to the issues that MMOs have when going into preservation, but it's kind of not necessarily so. It has been a long day. Words are not coming to my head. It's not necessarily so well known of within the arcade community, and really in retro games. Most people will just consider preserving a PCB or making sure the electromagnetic components of a pinball are kept up to date and the schematics are made. And I think that there's just not much attention paid to kind of the more newer generation and skill sets required for more modern game preservation. Anyways. That's kind of my high-level overview of modern internet-connected game preservation. If anyone has any questions, I'm pretty much open to Q&A on pretty much any topic related to Japanese games or preservation you'd want, and you can just kind of wander over to the mic there and ask away. Otherwise, I'll let you guys go early if there's none. Oh.
So I'm not going to wander over to that mic because I have one right here. Do people ever put any effort into translating the games, or is it just about making the games playable as they were in Japan?
That is an excellent question. So yeah, a lot of work is done to make the games more approachable for markets that they were never introduced. In fact, we actually have quite a few games that we brought over here are running fan translation patches, so that they are in English and they are more approachable. Most arcade games tend to be relatively intuitive because that's generally a good game design, but it is definitely a barrier for somebody trying to learn a game that's in a language that they don't understand. So yeah, most games usually will have a team, or at least people who are passionate enough to provide the translation files to the hackers who are working on these preservation projects to create patches. And it's usually an option when you go to deploy your software, whether you want to run it in the native Japanese or you want to apply a secondary patch on top of it. Oh, that mic is not on. It should be on. Nope, it's not on. Technical difficulties.
Awesome. So I know a lot of these games use additional things, physical things, like some of the machines they dispense cards, or collectible things. I know that a lot of the work has been done to make the hardware work the way that it was meant to work. Same thing with the card readers themselves. You use a particular card with these servers to enable it, or to save your scores and stuff.
Yep.
But those are physical things that will eventually not exist anymore, like the paper for the printers for the cards and things like that. And I'm curious if there's been any work done to kind of recreate the functionality to make those things, like, even after the game is, after all the paper is gone, after the printers have long broken, that there's still something to preserve that original functionality. Similar to I think back to Initial D version 8, 7, really any of the versions prior to the online versions. Those cards are impossible to find. Mm-hmm. So you cannot play those games with a card if you don't have a card. So is there any work that's been done to recreate a system that kind of makes the card system or that functionality work without the original methods?
Yep. So there's actually a couple questions in here. So I'm going to kind of just give a overview of the question in case anybody didn't hear. So kind of the first part of that question is there's kind of two topics here in cards. One is we actually have the physical game cards that most players will use to identify themselves and will be the identifier for the server to store their data. And then we have a second type of cards, which either older internet-connected games, older games that are not internet-connected, like Initial D, will use to store data for the player, or actually in more modern games, many arcade games now have a gotcha element to them, like a mobile game, and will actually physically print cards out depending on what you roll. To address the first one, the cards that you use to identify yourself, people have been doing a lot of work in figuring out whether it's the NFC or the RFID protocols or the different type of protocols and replicating them. So even games like Technica that used a very custom protocol and the cards no longer exist and are impossible to get, that information is usually published eventually open source, or if not, is relatively available as long as you know who to talk to, so that you can take generic cards generic NFC and RFID cards and reprogram them to work as an identifier for whatever game you're targeting. As for cards like the physical cards for pre-internet connected games, there is work on the more popular ones. So in the example of the earlier Initial Ds, there's actually a really pretty far progress on an emulator, essentially, where you use some NFC device, whether it's your phone or an e-amusement card or whatnot, tapped onto a device that communicates with a Raspberry Pi that plugs into the card reader and sends the appropriate data signals that had that card reader ran a card through would have had. Unfortunately, that is kind of a fairly small niche of the arcade gaming community, so other games that are not necessarily so popular as Initial D and Wongon Midnight will not frequently have the developers or the people willing to work on it to create those virtual ways of replicating physical cards. And then kind of like the last segment on gacha-based cards, unfortunately we didn't bring a machine that could showcase it because we can't source the paper. Those ones, they're a relatively new idea in Japan, having only been around for about 3 years. Sega and Konami, who both run very big card printing operations within their arcade games now, generally do not sell the paper and the ink required for us to print the games out. There is work even replicating those. People have managed to recreate the paper that the printer can take. It's a very custom paper with very interesting shapes so that it can feed through a special printer. And people have been trying to figure out how to get the ink to be replicated. But that's a struggle. And failing that, there's been work to create virtual versions of those. So like, yes, we may not be able to print you the card out that you should have physically gotten, but we have the systems in place so you could roll the gacha and like have it bound to your account, and you could have done everything that you would have been able to do on a real machine besides getting the physical card. Does that hopefully cover all three?
Yeah, cool. Thank you.
Hi.
Hey.
So I was thinking about a couple things. First of all, I'm wondering what the level of complexity needed for the servers to make the calls back to the devices. Are we talking about like actual servers or Raspberry Pis?
So you can do it in multiple ways. Most game servers have multiple different code bases because there's multiple groups working on them, and different groups usually have different focuses. So the Konami e-amusement server is the most common one you're going to see, and it's got the most amount of branches, so I'll kind of use that as my example. But there's a closed source version called Eagle, and it is probably the largest like actual arcade, quote-unquote arcade server. So if you go to an arcade and see a random Konami rhythm game and it's online, it's most likely connecting to the Eagle server, and that has a sister server called Flower in Europe, and then they cross-communicate. And those share a combined closed code base deployed on real servers using actually fairly modern practices. If you're into software development, like it's actually running on a Kubernetes cluster. But then we have things like Affixia Core, which is a very light, well, I wouldn't call it lightweight, but it's a small Konami e-amusement server that's meant to be run privately, where they're usually actually on the game itself, rather than having to have an external server, and you just do kind of a loop back and make the game think it's talking to a server when it's just talking to itself. Or you can run it on a Pi if you want to connect to multiple different computers. Sometimes you need something more powerful than a Pi because it's a Java app. But there is a lot of different types of servers created by different groups with different goals.
Okay, and I have a second question real quick.
Yeah.
Has this level of like preservation ever been translated into like other machinery? Because I have 2 Stern machines here that have Insider connected, and everything starts with good intentions, but one of my concerns is one day these will be internet connected or require an internet connection to keep working. Has anything been translated over to other areas?
So I unfortunately don't know enough about the pinball scene to like give you a solid answer on that, but I'm confident that when these pinballs start requiring internet connectivity for certain functionality, given how fervent the pinball scene has been about preserving your games, you will see definitely people going out and trying to replicate that. if I only had one small concern is that may be less and less true if the overall like age group of pinball keeps going up. I do notice that pinball seems to have a little bit of an issue attracting younger audiences, and a lot of the skills needed for this internet preservation tends to be more focused in within those younger audiences.
All right, thanks.
I'm back here. Quick question. The idea of fan-made content, because you talked about licensing, and sometimes the data is just completely gone. I'm assuming that the community sometimes steps in and creates content for some of the things. And the other question is, are they still doing this kind of model, this DRM type stuff today on arcade machines?
So, yeah, for the first one, fans definitely do make fan-made content. For some games, it's easier than others. It all depends on like whether we could source the tooling used usually to make game levels or game songs or game charts, and then the dedication of the community around it. Probably within the rhythm game scene, the most famous case of that is Musica Plus. We actually do have it here over in the back. It's been turned off, but because I forgot my keys at home, but I will be turning it on right after this presentation. And it is one that the game had died after Konami kind of gave up on it in a year and a half of service. And then the fan community in Europe and the US really picked it up and started publishing their own updates. So it gets actually updates every month now with between 1 and 3 songs per update. And it's widely considered like a living, breathing fan arcade game kind of built on top of what Konami had left and abandoned. As for whether like this current process of DRMing and all this server stuff and lockout is still in use, yeah, it's the primary way that arcade games are made in Japan. And I honestly think if it becomes profitable for American companies to develop more complex arcade games like the Japanese do, where it's really focused about retention play, getting people to come back and back by providing them, feedback loops, then you will even see American companies kind of moving towards that. It's just currently our market's not as developed so much for the Japanese arcade market to warrant that level of development into arcade games. But if we do get to that point, I think you will see that. And there's been a couple games right now pushing towards that. There's a Minecraft arcade game that recently came out that both prints cards and uses internet connectivity. Its offline mode is decent, but it's not locking you out, but a lot of the experiences require a server to give the game some information so that they can generate that experience. And once the servers for that Minecraft game are gone, then that Minecraft game will not be able to create the same experience as it did when the servers were around. Cool. Anybody else? Awesome. Well, I'm glad there were some good questions, and hopefully this didn't bore you too much because it was a bit technical and just mostly me talking. But I enjoyed being out here, and hopefully you all learned a little bit. Have a great rest of the show.